You're listening to The Uncooked Rice Show, a podcast where young Asian Americans talk about being young, Asian, and North American. I'm your host, Jesse Xie, an 18-year-old Chinese kid who's not a doctor, not a lawyer, and definitely not an engineer, talking to other young Asian Americans who would probably make my parents proud. Together, let's explore their successes, their struggles, and ultimately, their journey leaving the bamboo forest. Hey, welcome to the Uncooked Rice Show. This is episode 4, and today I'm joined by Kyle Yeung, a 18-year-old Chinese Canadian who's just finished high school. In high school, he was a part of a bunch of leadership opportunities, from helping develop the SOGI Program to some mental health workshops. Kyle, welcome to the show.
Hey, I'm happy to be here.
So Kyle, how's it feel finishing high school?
Less satisfying than I thought it would be, but less upsetting than I expected it to be after Corona hit.
That's true. I mean, what was, I guess, your worst regret?
I think my worst regret was probably I don't know. I try not to actively regret things that happened this year because it was so...
Not your fault?
Yeah, it was so global. It was not within my control at all. But I think, if anything, my regret was not being as proactive as I could have been in developing relationships with people outside my circle.
Right. I mean, I find that that's a big issue, like a big common issue with students and young people especially. Like even in university, there's a lot of talk about regretting not networking or not talking to their classmates and such. But I mean, it's a common issue, right? Like there's not much you can do about it.
Yeah, and I think it's just my own brain telling me that I didn't connect with as many people as I could have. Right. When I think in reality my connections are really solid.
Right. And it totally wasn't because nobody liked you, right?
Oh, well, that remains up to fate and...
Okay. All right. I'm only kidding. I'm joking. People like you, Kyle.
It's very early to get existential, Jesse.
Okay. All right. Anyways, so you finished high school, right?
Yeah.
And you talked a bit about your regrets. I mean, what do you think is your biggest accomplishment in high school?
Biggest accomplishment, probably breaking so much ground with SOGI and mental health, because it wasn't I started out in the school, and then I worked to the district level, and then I managed to reach the provincial level in March of this year, which was a new high for me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, okay, let's talk about that. So for our viewers who don't know what SOGI is, what does SOGI stand for?
So SOGI stands for Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity, and usually you'll hear the term SOGI applied in relation to terms like education or programs or curriculum or resources. And so the aim of SOGI as a whole, anything SOGI related, is to further the general awareness of people who might belong to a certain minority, whether it be of their orientation or their gender identity, or some variant of that experience.
Right. And what did you do exactly for the SOGI program? Like, how did it start? How did you get involved?
I actually didn't really envision myself starting. So I kind of just fell into it. In Stevenson, London, which is where I went to high school, we have this really flourishing leadership program where you have events called social responsibility days that are planned and led by older students for the benefit of younger students. And these events are fully interactive, and they're full day school sanctioned events. And when I started, it was because there was the opportunity to lead the first ever SOGI event in our city. Richmond, BC was the last city, I think, in the province. One of the last cities in the province, if not the province, then the Lower Mainland, to adopt the SOGI curriculum after a lot of contention and debate. And so I fell into the role because I felt like I needed to step up and break some ground on this kind of new thing of SOGI education.
Right. I mean, we're talking about breaking ground, and I mean, you felt like you had to be involved, right?
Yeah.
So why did you feel that? Like, why did you feel it was necessary, and what drove you to do so?
Honestly, before doing that, I was really cynical about student leadership as a concept and how it was manifested in our school, in our district, because it was kind of just like a buzzword, because you heard all these people talking about general subjects without really applying them at any risk to themselves. And I think that I signed up for SOGI because I was afraid that SOGI would just become a buzzword with little application. And I was worried that, first of all, that it could be distorted into something that the public would despise, because portions of the public in Richmond did despise it when it was still in its beginning stages. I was worried about that, and I was worried, second of all, that because I mean people are primarily cisgender, straight. That's just the way it goes, and I was just worried that these people would be leading the event, and it wouldn't be necessarily representative of what LGBT people in the school, the district, and the city actually wanted to see. So I felt a need to step up and be the representation of that voice.
Yeah, and I agree with you. Like, the last thing we want is words like concepts like SOGI to become like a buzzword where like kids put student leadership as like an entrepreneur thing on their LinkedIn account and just assume that it's
self-employed.
Exactly, self-employed. Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. But can you tell us a bit about your experience with the LGBTQ community?
Well, there wasn't really a community to begin with in my experience in my childhood growing up. I think I grew up in a pretty sheltered household, as anyone in Richmond often does, because, you know, first generation East Asian immigrant, both parents working class professionals, and both of them being like from Hong Kong. So they're and they grew up in the 70s and 80s, so pretty conservative. And on top of that, we grew up in a religious household. I think it was Anglican Christian, evangelical Christian. I'm not quite sure what the term is, but yeah, it was that kind of upbringing. And so I didn't really hear about the LGBT community, or like LGBT people for that matter, because it was always a non-issue in the worst of ways.
A taboo, right?
Yeah,
subject, essentially. Yeah. But how did you come to realize that you were queer?
Well, I mean, I think in the same way that everyone realizes, like, you just, like when it comes to orientation, you find out because you have a crush on someone that you didn't expect. But like more than that, I think like there were little hints, like there's a stereotype about queer men being more creative and more artistic and more drawn to things that are related to expression as opposed to like athletic or academic output. Right. And I think that well, I grew up figure skating competitively, so there was your first clue.
Okay.
But aside from that, like I was always just a little bit more empathetic, and I think a lot more driven to cater to people on the basis of their emotions. That's how I learned to interact with people, and I think that was my biggest hint growing up.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean nowadays, like the progressive movement involving, I guess, the understanding of non-straight, non-cisgender people, it's become more understanding in our society, right? So
yeah, I should hope so.
Do you feel like you fit into this idea that there has to be a category where you have to choose whether you're straight, bi, or do you just consider yourself queer?
Well, for the most part, I call myself. When I came out initially back in 2015, in the 7th grade, I was quote unquote bisexual.
Right.
And I think that like that word was accurate at the time, but it's not anymore. And sometimes like, and now I use the word gay, but like, I think that that's a choice to use those words in relation to yourself.
Right.
And it's a choice that you need not make, but it is a choice that makes interacting with people and helping them understand you a bit easier.
Right.
If that makes sense, yeah.
No, I agree. And I think to your point, it's not a choice you make, and it's certainly not a choice other people can make for you, right?
Well, they often do, but that's the uncomfortable truth.
So this, okay, admittedly, we're recording this in June, so it is almost the end of Pride Month.
Yeah.
So do you think that more adults and especially more young people should have this conversation about the queer experience and what it means to be queer?
I think that people underestimate, because people like, I talked to some older people in the gay community, some older professionals this year. I had the opportunity to talk to them, and I think that their attitude was that like, oh, I'm just the same as everyone else. And I think that there is some merit in that. But I think that like you can almost be more aggressive with it as we move forward in our upcoming generations, to be like, these points that separate you from themselves, that these points that separate you from the overall population, these points that distinguish you, that's what they are. They can be distinctions if you choose to make them distinctions. And if you choose to have those conversations, like you said, to examine how the different things that you are, be it that you're a person of color or that you're queer in some way, examine how those distinctions give you a unique outlook and a unique ability to help your community, whoever your community is. So yes, those conversations are very helpful because they allow you to mine your own potential.
And pivoting a bit away from this the question that I just asked, do you think that schools should engage in more of these conversations with their students?
I mean, I know you. I think you're super like practical, and I think you're a very pragmatic person.
Thank you. I hope this isn't going towards an insult. But...
Oh no. I think you'd know if I were trying to say something shady. But I think like I think we've had discussions about this before, and I think my position has always been like, it doesn't necessarily have to be a sanctioned activity that people have these conversations under the supervision or the watchful gaze of teachers and administrators. But I think that school, bottom line, is a place to learn.
Right.
And bottom line is that you have to learn not only about the world around you, but also about yourself. Like, introspection is such a huge part of the BC curriculum today. Course. And I think that to that end, school has to be able to facilitate those conversations if they happen. They don't necessarily have to go out of their way to act as a catalyst for them, but I think that these conversations should be welcome in school if they are going to be had.
So you think there doesn't need to be explicit content, but rather they should be a free space, essentially. It's free and safe space for these conversations to be had.
Yeah, I think that school can do a lot in the way of dispensing or like distributing information, just so that people can begin to have those conversations. But I think that like actually encouraging these conversations to happen, like actively, like through the use of curriculum or lessons or events or what have you, that might not be the job of the school. That might be at the discretion of the school to do. But I think that like encouraging people to feel safe enough to have those conversations is also a duty of the school, or should be moving forward.
Yeah, I think so. Like, we're seeing more conversations about schools and education having a broader perspective on diversity and inclusion, right? Yeah. And the worst thing we want is to, as you said earlier, is to have these words become buzzwords. Yeah. Right. So it's important for schools people to encourage their students to be able to, express their opinions, but also be open-minded about other opinions, right?
Yeah, and I think, a huge job of school, I think, is preparing you to be able to converse in a way that allows you to express your own worldview without necessarily negating other people's worldviews.
Okay, so let's talk about the idea of the SOGI program then. At the end of it, like, you've graduated, I'm assuming, are you still helping out with the program?
I don't know if I will be actively helping out with it, but I think that I'll be there as a resource if they need me.
That's fair. I mean, now that you've essentially graduated from high school and away from the SOGI program, what do you think was the best thing about it? Like, what do you think worked?
I think that, I mean, I don't know if you knew this. We had conversations about it, like, in the year that I was preparing this event. I think on the night of like a school dance or something, we were just standing outside.
Probably, we're loners.
Talking about this.
We organize things rather than
we're lone wolves. We're the overlords. And you were talking about how like you had chosen to not necessarily participate in it actively, and I think that like I think that conversation was useful because it allowed me to discern what my aims for the event would be, and I think we made those aims very clear And those aims were that we didn't aim to change anyone's minds, because I was very well aware of the fact that different social and cultural and religious values and ways of thinking can contradict with the idea of LGBT people, or like the idea of an LGBT culture. Those things don't necessarily intersect in a very harmonious way, and I was very careful to make it clear throughout the 3 events that I planned of this nature, that our event was purely informative, and that our goal was not to change anyone's minds, but to provide them the information with which to make the decisions for themselves. And I think that when you take a non-confrontational stance like that, a stance that is purely for the sake of conversation or like dialogue, then people on the other end open up to whatever information you're dispensing.
I want to agree with you there, but admittedly, there are people who will think that that's more of a optimistic outlook.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, we often see in history that the revolution and change, especially change in ideals and morals, aren't easily sort of persuaded by conversation, just open dialogue, right? Like oftentimes we have to see radical action. And the idea of it being informative, especially in a school district environment, seems a bit too political, right? Wouldn't you say?
But because it is education.
It is, right? Yeah. But the thing is, the other thing is that it's more than just like a culture, right? And so this conversation, I think, that schools are trying to have and trying to tiptoe around, it's a bit more. It's a slow process because they're trying to tiptoe around the subject.
Yeah.
I think. Like, would you agree in that sense?
Yeah, and I think like what I said about like taking a non-confrontational approach,
mm-hmm.
I think that's just the way I choose to approach it, because.
And that's totally fine.
Yeah, and that's not to disregard the more the more active, more head-on work that other people might do, and I think that like having spoken to education professionals about this,
mm-hmm.
I think that it's a very difficult job to satisfy everyone involved. Like I remember watching this movie about Lyndon B. Johnson.
Right.
About like how he was trying to improve civil rights for African Americans, while also making sure that the country didn't fall apart into a partisan and a racial divide.
Right.
And I think that like it's a very microscopic version of that in this city, because you have on one side the kids who are first person impacted by this education, and first person impacted by the discrimination that occurs against them perpetually. But then you also have the parents or the religious communities, or even some of the other kids, the people who feel like it should be at their own discretion to be able to say, I don't want to learn this, because it is like a publicly funded education system. And I think that it's a very delicate tightrope to walk between making sure one party's desires are met and another party's desires are met. And I think that aggressive action or active action can be difficult to take, precisely because of that thin line between upsetting one party while appeasing another.
Yeah, so I think just to clarify your point, it's difficult because you're taking a more non-confrontational role, right?
Yeah.
And I think we have to be sure to clarify that we've been sort of more privileged than most.
Oh,
around
100%.
The world, especially in our community, to have people who are more accepting of us and essentially our sexual orientation, right?
Yeah.
And because we were more accepting, we view it in a different angle than those who have been more affected and more discriminated against by it. And I think it isn't to say that the more confrontational, reactions to their discrimination is at all, ineffective, or at all worse, or at least better way than a non-confrontational role, right?
Yeah.
Anyways, so let's move on to another subject. So, do you think that students are supported enough, like LGBTQ students are supported enough in school?
I think that the support is there, but the access isn't necessarily there. Like the ease of access, the comfort with which these resources can be accessed is not necessarily there. Because having spoken to many of the teachers in the school, professionals in the district,
Right.
I know that the support exists.
Yeah.
But that isn't to say that
the stigma isn't there.
yeah, and that isn't to say that the support is visible. Sometimes the support exists, but you aren't necessarily sure of whether or not you can access it. And you like privately, I know many teachers who have expressed different like opposing views. So it's also a game of like figuring out who you can come to. So that is to say, like, though there might be support in the district or like in the curriculum,
Yeah.
or even like formally encoded support in like the code of conduct or the BC Ministry of Education guidelines, that's not to say that that support can be accessed. And that's the important part, is making sure that people go out of their way to let people know, regardless of whether it's sexual orientation, gender identity, race, class, whatever have you, that these issues can be presented in school if you're seeking help.
And I think it's a lot of the times kids who don't feel comfortable accessing these resources is because they think that there are more costs than there are benefits, right? I mean, sometimes we see teachers saying the idea that teachers are accepting of this, but sometimes you go up to a teacher and then you don't feel comfortable engaging in the subject for one reason or another.
Yeah.
And it's difficult because usually when you're a student who's not feeling comfortable speaking about their own issues, when you go to a teacher or to somebody who you are supposed to trust, right, and they don't, reciprocate essentially the reaction that you would like, the support that you need, and the guidance that you deserve, it tends to sort of discourage them from seeking out support again.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's not necessarily to, at the risk of sounding like an apologist, I think that's not to say that like it's necessarily it's not necessarily to place fault on the teachers or the administration. I think that sometimes I just think it's like the power of time. You just have to wait for people to acclimate to certain ideas.
Yeah, but I will point out that you can't just wait around for these issues, right? I mean, sometimes these change requires action, right?
Yeah.
And so essentially adopting that viewpoint would be dangerous, because essentially you're saying that it would be best to just sit back, observe, and wait until your time comes, right?
I think that it's like it's due to the personal actions that people can choose to take. It's not like their obligation to, like, it's not anyone's obligation to say like have those conversations with the teacher, but I think that those conversations do benefit the larger kind of discussion we're trying to have about trying to move things forward, because having that one discussion with that one teacher allows that one teacher to affect more students.
Right. Oh, okay.
Those students being
So I think I
more
misunderstand your point, and just to clarify it to the viewers, essentially what you were saying earlier about needing time. It's not to say that it's not to say that you should wait around for people's opinions to change. It should be that you need to actively go out and change their opinions, and it would take time to change their opinions.
Yeah,
right?
100%.
Okay, yeah, we just want to be careful with
that's
with
okay.
the opinions, right? Okay, so I mean, for example, like I have a lot of friends who are straight and cisgender, right? And
me too.
Congratulations, that's fine. No, but they are. I've been lucky that they've been really accepting and really supportive, considering that a lot of places around the world, the idea of homosexuality, the idea of LGBTQ and being queer is sort of frowned upon.
Oh,
right?
Punishable.
Yeah, punishable too. I mean, what advice do you think you can give these allies, essentially, on how to better encourage and support the people who are of LGBTQ?
I think that it's not necessarily about being okay with it. Because as much as it may relieve us to hear that you're okay with it, what we want to hear is that you love it, or not necessarily love, but you appreciate it because you understand that it's a part of who we are, and it's a part of us that usually makes us a good person because it brings a unique experience to our history. And I think that kind of principle of like actively not only tolerating something, not only accepting something, but also like understanding how it makes each person unique,
right,
and useful in their own way. That's an important step that people don't often take, and of course it's not their obligation to take it, but it would be nice to see. And I think like that links back to this ongoing discussion with Black Lives Matter about the difference between a non-racist and an anti-racist.
Right. It's not just enough to be like non-racist, right?
Yeah.
It's not just enough to be non-homophobic. You have to actively confront these stigmas, this discrimination, and actively seek to better the world, essentially, right?
Yeah, because you have to actively confront these attitudes in yourself, and most importantly in yourself, but also in the people around you, to your own ability.
Right.
And that's how change begins, because structural change has its own benefits, but you can't count on structural change to, like we discussed earlier, just passively arrive.
Right.
Structural change is the successor of lots of individual people making their own changes,
right,
for the idea of a greater good. And you have to believe that the changes that you personally make will cause some greater macroscopic consequence.
Right. And I agree with you. Like, it's not about just one person making change. It's about everyone making change consistently over time, over a long period of time, unfortunately. But it's about actually going out and actively trying, right? Actively confronting these things that makes it so important for society, right? And I think, because I graduated a year before you, right?
Yes.
So, and the thing is, my also greatest regret was that I wasn't that involved in a lot of leadership roles that involved supporting the LGBTQ community. Although we tried with Student Council and Rich City Idol, it wasn't that prominent of a direction that we were taking. But for you, I was wondering, did you have any experiences with other kids in the queer community that you had stories of, or you heard stories of?
This is gonna a little bit somber, but there was this kid in PE 9 with me, and he was visibly effeminate, and that's not his fault. I don't fault him for that. That's just
and it's not a fault, right?
Yeah, and it's not a fault. That's just who he was, and that's how he presented. And unfortunately, people would tease him a lot, to the point where if you remember the boys' locker room in our school, there's a little washroom stall in the back of the room.
Right.
And he would go in there to change, which is not very common of people to do so. And then eventually the teasing and the ridicule got so bad that he would go outside of the gym to change. He would go to the restroom outside of the gym to change. And then it got so bad that he transferred schools and went somewhere else for the duration of his high school career, the remaining duration. And I was in that class with him, and I was too afraid to say anything because I was worried that all this negative attention he was getting would come down on me, right, which was, in hindsight, a cowardly thing to do. But you're right in saying that, like, we have been treated better than many people, and not just in the world, in our own communities, in our own schools. There can often be very upsetting and very disgraceful things to happen to people of color, people of
different gender identities, sexual orientations.
People with different backgrounds, period.
Right. I agree with you. It's, I mean, not being more supportive, I think taking more action and being more actively confrontational about these discriminations was one of my biggest regrets so far. And I think definitely one of yours too, I believe, right?
I think, well, I think, like, it's also, like, I've taken steps to address that regret by doing things. But I think it's also not something necessarily that you ought to feel bad about if you are a queer person, because while there is that understanding that someone else suffered because you didn't say something, there should also be the understanding that you were also in a position where you could have suffered. And it's like, you know how on airplanes you have to put on your own mask before like securing the masks of your children? Like, you have to protect yourself, and you shouldn't fault yourself for not saying something if you genuinely believed at the time that if you had said something or done something that people could have hurt you.
Right. I agree with you there, and I think it's important once you realize that fact, and once you've come to the realization of that fact, that you start to take more active steps to actually, support those around you, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's finish this interview off with one last question. So, what do you think students can do, especially in schools and public education, to better support people who are discriminated against, whether it's because of their gender identity, sexual orientation, or even just race in general?
I think, and I'm saying this as someone who has no ethos in this concept of education, as like, aside from the fact that I was a student.
Right.
I think that education systems can do a lot more to address problems that we see in today's society if we realize that those problems are just the late manifestations of problems that emerge in childhood and in adolescence. If we take, and I'm going to give you a concrete example, if we take steps in elementary school curriculum and secondary school curriculum to address racial prejudice actively,
right,
and make it clear to these students what is necessarily the right way to behave, and having those discussions with people very early on before they enter the world, then we can address those issues before they become cemented, because a lot of the ideas that you have in, like, when you become an adult, they can stay with you. And I think it is while children are changeable, while people are changeable, that you need to address these problems, because the fact of the matter is, whether or not, regardless of the fact that it would be hard to reinstate some kind of like anti-racism education, the fact of the matter is that if you do not do so, those problems may surface later on,
right,
in your life, and that will come at the cost of that society.
Like, psychology states that a lot of human personality is responsible because of nurture, right?
Yeah.
And so the idea that having kids especially grow up in an environment where they're more exposed to different perspectives, different diversities, different races, different sexual orientations, it's more beneficial than them being stuck in a sort of culture where there's homophobia, there's racism, there's a lot of discrimination and stigma, right?
Yeah.
So bringing more exposure is definitely, bringing more education on the subject is definitely a great idea to sort of enforce this idea that it's not a bad thing to be different.
Yeah.
Right? All right, so Kyle, thank you for your time. If people want to find you, where can they search you up?
You can search me on Instagram, KY_YEUNG. Aside from that, you can find me on Facebook, but Instagram.
Nobody uses Facebook. All right, thank you, Kyle, for your time.
Yeah, thank you, Jay.
Hey, thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Uncooked Rice Show. If you are enjoying the content that we're producing, feel free to follow us on Instagram at Uncooked Rice Show. We'll be trying to upload new episodes every Thursday. So until then, see you soon.